Continuing my retrograde post-postmortem, the other question I get asked most frequently is, how did you do it financially? And, well, I previously worked in AAA game development, and I worked a lot of hours, and I got paid overtime. And also, when you're working pretty much constantly, you don't really have time to spend your money on anything because you don't have time to spend. So I had saved up about $100,000 in my savings account, and investments and whatnot when starting 24 karat games. And while that seems like a lot, I didn't move away from the Los Angeles area, which has a very high cost of living, which to some extent I regret, but I think overall I'm very glad I didn't, because I was able to meet my wife, who lives in the area, and I couldn't imagine what I'd do without her. So glad I didn't move away, but certainly when thinking about independent game development, it's worth thinking about not where you want to live, but where you could tolerate living that has a much lower cost of living. So basically I burned through my savings, and I started borrowing money from my parents, which I don't know if they're ever getting paid back, unfortunately. Sorry, Mom and Dad. Well, we'll see. We'll see how things go. But the other thing is, I basically mooched off my wife. I got married maybe halfway through the project, and when we lived together and combined my non-existent income with my wife's income, we could scrape by. But like I said in the last video, it was difficult, and I had to tell my wife, like, no, we can't afford this. No, we need to save money. And that's a terrible thing to have to tell your wife, especially when I could get a high-paying job doing game development. Presumably, I'm not trying to boast or exaggerate, but I think I'm pretty good at game development. I think most people who've worked with me have agreed that, I'm good at what I do, which one would think would translate well into the performance of retrograde, but apparently not. But I put her in a difficult situation, and it put a lot of strain in our marriage, because basically I was working all the time, which was tough enough, when you're starting a marriage, but I wasn't making any money. And the fact that I could get a job and start making money is sort of frustrating. But the other thing I did is I ended up doing some extra work on the side, which obviously added to the stress, and was difficult to balance that and retrograde. But I couldn't afford to finish the game without it, and certainly I couldn't afford the things I needed to in my life, like paying for a wedding and getting married and other various expenses. So basically it was a lot of saving, a lot of thrifty living, and generosity of my family, my wife and my parents. And so the real upsetting part is that it didn't pay off. The investment did not pay off at all. Like, we haven't made back what we spent on the game, like out of pocket costs for QA, the art, and everything. We haven't even made back that, let alone cost of living for 4 years. So it's really tough, and I think that the most difficult part about it was when I watched Indie Game the movie with my wife. This was before Retrograde is shipped, and and she saw these developers who, created these amazing games, but they were in a similar situation to us before release. But the thing was, their stories had a happy ending, and so I saw it on my wife's face. I saw this smile, this hope, that she was positively radiant, and it was soul crushing. It was devastating because, even before release, I knew there was no way we could even come close to the success of these games, just because no one had heard about Retrograde, and certainly that's a failing on my part, I think, for marketing. But it was so devastating to see the hope and then just sort of try and say, no, 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 you gotta lower your expectations. It's not going to be a hit like these games. It's not going to be this successful. I don't think all of our problems are going to be solved. But then the real sort of kick in the ass is, even with my modest expectations, the game did worse. It did significantly, it did way worse than I even thought was possible. Like, I had very, very conservative, this is the worst case numbers, and we did much worse than that. And, I mean, that's what is so difficult about Retrograde, that makes it very difficult for me